This video is sponsored by Nebula, the educational streaming service created by me and my creator friends. Check out the link in the description or stay tuned to learn more. Brisbane is one of the most stunning cities in the world, with its grand parks, waterfronts, and skyline, and as the host of a surprisingly large rail and bus network and the 2032 Olympic Games, it's high time we explain the transit in this tropical metropolis, which has elements in common with its Australian sister cities of Perth, Melbourne, and Sydney. So let's take a look into Brisbane's surprisingly comprehensive public transport system. Brisbane is the capital of the Australian state of Queensland and the centre of the southeast Queensland region with over 2.5 million residents that stretches to the north and south. The city is built around the winding Brisbane River and has a warm tropical climate. I can also remember seeing tons of bats when I visited the city last, something which I can't ever recall seeing in Canada. So yeah, bats. Neat. Brisbane Central Business District, or CBD, is squeezed into one of the river's bends, about 15 kilometers inland, and is flanked by the Botanic Gardens and the city's main rail corridor to the west. At the very center are the lovely pedestrianized areas on Queen and Albert Streets. Across the river to the southeast is the Gabba, a cricket ground and major events center in the city, which is located in the Wollongabba area. While to the southwest is the Brisbane Convention Centre and the very cool Streets Beach, which is an artificial beach in the middle of the city. To the west of the centre is Suncorp Stadium, which hosts soccer and rugby games and will be the main stadium for the 2032 Olympic Games, which will be hosted by the Brisbane region. In order to handle that major international event, Brisbane's airport, which is 13 kilometers northeast of the CBD, will be expanded, with a new terminal north of its existing two and between its two runways. Now, I mentioned it's the Brisbane region that's hosting the Olympics, because the city of Gold Coast, which is actually one of Australia's largest cities and just 70 kilometers southeast of Brisbane, is also hosting a number of events. This city is remarkable, with its high-rise skyline, including the tallest building in Australia, not far from tens of kilometers of pristine surfing beaches. There's even an area called Surfer's Paradise. All of this, as well as the smattering of malls and theme parks, have made the area a major tourism destination. Heading back to central Brisbane, we have its two main train stations, which both serve through trains. Central, which is topped by high-rises and thus almost entirely underground and serves the main part of the CBD, and Roma Street, which serves all services which call it Central, as well as intercity trains to New South Wales and regional Queensland. Of course, the vast majority of services through Roma Street and Central are from Queensland Rail, which runs the state rail network, and the suburban city train network, which will be the focus of this video. The entire Queensland rail network is built on 1067mm narrow gauge tracks, and the entire city train network is electrified with 25 kilovolt AC overhead wires, which actually extend hundreds of kilometers north beyond the end of frequent passenger service. In this way, Brisbane reminds me a lot of Perth, which has a network much like Brisbane's that was electrified later than other major Australian cities, thus the AC electrification. The city train network really is no slouch. It's hundreds of kilometers long and has over 150 stations along its various lines, which mostly trace the Brisbane region from north to south. The grand scale of this network means there's a ton of variety across it, like other Australian cities such as Sydney. From urban corridors to ones travelling through rural areas, and much like Melbourne, the network features a lot of grade crossings, even on sections with 4 tracks. There are also a lot of park and rides in outer suburban areas and freight services which share numerous corridors with passenger trains. So let's dive into more detail on the network's individual lines. The central stations of the Queensland City Train network are Roma Street and Central Station in central Brisbane. Central has 3 island platforms, while Roma Street has 3 island platforms and 3 side platforms, and because trains from New South Wales serve Roma Street, some tracks are equipped with dual gauge. Both stations are connected together with 4 tracks traveling through tunnels, and there are 4 tracks extending pretty far to the north and south of central Brisbane as well. However, these are seriously impeded in their capacity by the throats of Roma Street Station, that is the tracks approaching it from either side, which, in a sign of things to come, have a ton of flat junctions. South of Roma Street, the tracks divide into 2 corridors. One of these heads east, cutting across the tracks approaching the station to the 2-track Maryvale Bridge over the Brisbane River, and then expanding into 3 tracks to serve the city's South Bank area with several stations. This corridor continues on to split into 2 branches, again with a flat junction, with the first double track and then single track with passing loops Cleveland Line heading east and the Beenleigh and Gold Coast Line heading south, with triple track to the north and double track to the end of the line. The triple track allows interurban services headed to Gold Coast, which are similar to New South Wales Trainlink services in Sydney, to bypass most stops until Beenleigh, where frequent suburban service ends. The other corridor heading south of Roma Street to the southwest heads to the Springfield and Rosewood and Ipswich lines, which share a quad-track trunk for much of their length before splitting with a flying junction and continuing to their termini, with Rosewood to the southwest and Springfield to the south as double-track lines. Interestingly, despite sharing a quad-tracked corridor for most of their length, all services on the shared corridor make all stops. Now, when you look at the network to the north of Roma Street and Central, it appears at first like there are tons of branches compared to the south, and while there are, it's not quite so simple. That's because the Doomben line, which has just 4 stops and is entirely single track with passing loops, and the airport line, which is longer, with basically its entire 8-kilometer length on a single track viaduct before serving 2 stations several kilometers apart at the international and domestic airport terminals, really don't serve all that many trains per hour. Just 2 on the Doomben line and up to 4 on the airport line. Interestingly, like in Sydney, the airport line is run by a private company, and services on it take about 20 minutes to get to the city centre. All of this means that, like to the south, there are really 4 main lines heading north from central Brisbane, funneling into a quad-track corridor, with 2 funneling into each track pair, and 1 set of those 2 sharing capacity with the airport and Doomben line. The first line to split off just north of central Brisbane, and with a flyover from the eastern pair of tracks, is the Fernie Grove line, which is all double-track and travels to the northwest of the city centre. Following north along the quad-track trunk after passing Eagle Junction Station, the Doomben and Airport lines split off one after another from the eastern track pair with flat junctions, the Doomben line heading east and southeast, and the Airport line heading east and north. Just a little further north, the Shorncliffe line, which is all double-tracked except for the last leg into Shorncliffe Station, splits off the trunk with a flat junction, but in this case things are mostly fine because the corridor shortly thereafter narrows to 3 tracks, and trains headed north use the western 2 tracks on the quad-track trunk. As it turns out, the northern quad-track trunk does see local and express services, with the Shorncliffe, Airport, and Doomben lines stopping at intermediate stations, which services that travel further north do not. Those services would be the ones traveling to the Redcliffe Peninsula line, which splits off the now triple-track trunk after a short section of quad-track south of Petrie Station, which has 2 widely spaced island platforms which set up wide curves and a flyover to the station's north, which is a really good place to watch trains. The Redcliffe Peninsula line, like the also new Springfield line, is all double-tracked and grade separated, and serves a ton of parking and new suburban development on the peninsula, after which it was given its name. There is one more line which continues beyond the Redcliffe Peninsula line, which similarly to the Beenleigh and Gold Coast lines makes few stops on sections of track shared with its shorter distance cousin, and forms an interurban service to the north, and that is the Caboolture and Sunshine Coast line, which travels 150 kilometers north of central Brisbane, with double track to Caboolture and single track with passing loops beyond. This line does serve the Sunshine Coast, which is one of the areas that's also hosting the Brisbane 2032 games, but as with the Gold Coast line, it travels inland, not necessarily directly serving the main population centers. Now, I've already mentioned the narrow gauge that Brisbane's railway system uses, but did you know that Australia widely uses 3 different rail gauges on all kinds of different systems, from metros to regional rail to trams? If you want to learn more about why the country came to the current state of a mess of rail gauges that it is, I have an exclusive video on Nebula on this right now. Nebula is the streaming platform owned by me and my creator friends, featuring over 14,000 titles that you can watch ad-free, including exclusive and early access videos from urbanist educational creators like myself, City Nerd, City Beautiful, and Not Just Bikes. I've recently been checking out all of the Nebula Plus content from my fellow urbanist channel City Beautiful, and this episode on whether jaywalking should be legal really piqued my interest, as someone who lives in a big city and has to make decisions like whether to jaywalk, of course, every day in my daily life. And you can watch many more bonus videos just like this one, all available on Nebula right now. This is one of the best ways you can support my channel and my content as a whole, and right now, for the month of September, you'll have access to lifetime memberships for only $300 to get access to Nebula as long as both Nebula and you exist. And even after this, you'll still be able to get a great deal on yearly memberships for only $2.50 a month. So go check out the link on screen or in the description right now to see the exclusive video. Now, since trains can run through the city centre of Brisbane, services are formed by pairing lines to the north and south of the city. Cleveland Line trains run north to the Shorncliffe Line, and Gold Coast trains from Varsity Lakes travel to the airport every 30 minutes, with additional services between the airport and central areas which turn around in the city centre, bringing the airport up to a train every 15 minutes. Meanwhile, Beenleigh trains head to the Fernie Grove Line, while Doomben Line services run to the centre and terminate at Roma Street. Finally, Springfield and Rosewood Line services run through the centre up to the Redcliffe Peninsula and Sunshine Coast lines respectively. Now, what you might notice is that there are effectively two independent sets of services. Those traveling to the far north and southwest use the Western Track pair through central Brisbane, while those to the northwest, northeast, east, and southeast use the other pair, with far more flat junctions and branching. There is actually also one extra service, which is a looping train which serves Exhibition Station near the main central Queensland Rail Yard, which is literally called Main Yard, after a family whose last name was coincidentally Main, and other central stations. This service actually won't be running in the future, so I'm mainly mentioning it for completion's sake. While Brisbane's railway network is extensive, what goes too often missed in my opinion is its impressive system of busways, which are filled with elevated stations, tunnels, and tons of useful connections to universities, hospitals, and other major destinations. This network is formed of 4 busways, though they are mostly interlinked and have a ton of ramps and connection points which allow various bus routes to pop onto and off of the busways to speed up their trips around town. The Inner Northern Busway extends from Roma Street north, with tunnels and even an elevated section, running a total of around 7 kilometers, to the south end of the Northern Busway. A tunnel through Brisbane CBD with 2 stations at Queen Street and King George Square connects it with the Southeastern Busway. Both underground stations have screened doors for safety and comfort, primarily to reduce exposure to diesel fumes. The Southeastern Busway is a roughly 15-kilometer route heading naturally southeast from Brisbane CBD, crossing the Brisbane River on the Victoria Bridge and connecting to the Southeastern rail lines at Southbank Station. From here, the route heads east with a branch to the Gabba before continuing southeast to connect to Buranda Station and then traveling along the Pacific Highway. The last busway in the system is the 5-kilometer Eastern Busway, which is more like an east-west orbital route across southern Brisbane. The route starts in the west with a stop at the University of Queensland before cutting east with a number of bridges and tunnels to the Southeastern Busway, which it runs along for a short while before branching east once again and running through a few more stations. The bridge connecting the busway to the University of Queensland is incredibly impressive because the busway is the only thing that uses it, besides a pedestrian and cycling path. As it turns out, there is a 4th busway, which is a shorter stretch separated from the rest of the network that extends from the Inner Northern Busway that I mentioned earlier, and that would be the Northern Busway, which features tunnels, 2 stations, and 1 busway stop. Busway stops, unlike stations, have fewer facilities and are usually skipped by most services. At the northern end of the busway, major roadworks along Gympie Road are adding bus lanes to effectively extend the route further. The busway network is already quite large and it manages to serve a ton of routes, but it's set to get even more interesting as I'm going to discuss a little later. Now, while I won't go into great detail on them, as you might imagine, beyond just buses and trains, Brisbane's riverside location means it's also served by a number of ferry routes, with over 20 ferries, mostly of the catamaran variety, serving the city. But there's also trams, sort of. As it turns out, Gold Coast is served by the really nice and attractive G-Link service which opened in 2014. And has big 7-segment Flexity 2 trams, with space for surfboards and a 20-kilometer route with 19 stops and surprisingly spry service. There's something that just feels so cool and unique about a tram which serves a tropical environment like this. Better yet, in the second phase of the project, the line was extended to the Gold Coast line at Helensvale, meaning that you can ride from the center of Brisbane to some of the best beaches in the world all on rails. There are also a number of park and rides out near the highways, which helps keep cars out of the denser areas near the beaches, and the route connects to a ton of major destinations from hospitals to universities and malls. Even cooler, it runs 24 hours on the weekend with a tram every 30 minutes, something I wish we saw far more widely. What's awesome about all of these various transit services is that they all use the integrated Go card from Cubic, allowing you to ride trains, trams, buses, and ferries with a single card. And recently, with the rollout of smart ticketing, you can pay with your phone or bank card instead of needing a Go card in the first place, a feature that every city could use to reduce the barriers that exist to using transit. While all of this is great, and Brisbane has a surprisingly comprehensive transit system for a city of its size in the English-speaking world, the big expansion plans for the city and region have got me even more excited. For one, G-Link is being extended south with 8 new stops over 6 kilometers of track in the next few years, and even better, one more extension of similar length could take it to the Gold Coast Airport, massively cutting the need for out-of-state tourists to ever get in a car on their trip to the coast. And then there's Brisbane Metro, which has a bad name that has got it in some trouble with the skeptical public, but which in my opinion is super cool. The original proposal for Brisbane Metro was very gadgety, retrofit the busways with autonomous rubber tire trains, but instead, a much more sensible plan has been approved. Brisbane has acquired a series of tram-sized, 24-meter-long bi-articulated electric buses, possibly the first in the English-speaking world, from legendary Swiss manufacturer Hess to run a high-frequency electric bus service along core parts of the busway system, where there aren't mixed-traffic operations, and like G-Link, the service will operate 24 hours over weekends. The buses are something really special. They feature tons of space, Wi-Fi, USB charging, beautiful wayfinding screens, all-door boarding, and even a separate cabin for the driver. And they'll be recharged by rapid charge points at the ends of routes in as little as 4 minutes. Along with these lovely new vehicles, the busways are getting a bunch of upgrades, including enhanced stations, a conversion of the city centre Victoria Bridge to exclusive use by buses, pedestrians, and cyclists, and a new section of tunnel direct into the King George Square station in the CBD. The network will see 2 services operate, one from the Southeast Busway to Roma Street, and another from the Inner Northern Busway to UQ Lakes on the Eastern Busway. Better yet, plans call for extending the services in various directions, and the low cost of expansion means it seems likely that that will actually happen. And if it does, Brisbane can create a big network of electric high-capacity bus services across the city, though I would like to see in-motion trolley charging added in the future to reduce any charging downtime. And the benefits spread to the suburbs as well, as a simplification and rationalization of busway services will free up more vehicles for suburban service. Now, as much as I like the Ottawa O-Train as an idea, it's hard to see Brisbane's plans and not at least think, what if Ottawa, which was actually the inspiration for Brisbane's busways, had built a downtown tunnel and done what Brisbane is doing instead of converting its busway to rail? The final project coming to Brisbane is even bigger, because every major Australian city needs to have a massive rail expansion scheme. In Brisbane's case, that's the creatively named Cross River Rail, which is rail crossing a river. Cross River Rail is an 11-kilometer new rail line, sort of, which adds 6 kilometers of new cross-city tunnel, and when I say cross-city, I mean it, as the new tunnels cut across the CBD rather than running north-south along the edge of it. The project will add 2 new underground platforms at Park Road on the Cleveland, Beenleigh, and Gold Coast lines, as well as at Roma Street, while adding new underground stations at Woolloongabba and Albert Street in the center of the CBD. All of these new underground stations will see new transit-oriented development built on top, and they'll also have platform screen doors just like the Metro Tunnel in Melbourne. As part of the project, a number of other stations, such as Exhibition and a bunch on the Gold Coast line, are getting big overhauls, and the ETCS signaling is being implemented to allow higher frequency, meaning the tunnel will be exclusive to the lovely ETCS-compatible NGR trains, which are some of my favorite out there. There's also going to be various yard and infrastructure improvements, and the project should be open around 2026. That being said, the impact of Cross River Rail is not as positive as it could be. Direct service from the Gold Coast to the airport is being traded off for continuous running between the interurban lines, which I kind of like. But there's also a lot of incongruency in the plans, which are meant to boost capacity on the network, that could have a lot more capacity for less money if it just implemented the same signaling upgrades as with Cross River Rail, built some more quad and double track, and added a bunch of flyovers. Of course, ultimately, this project is adding another track pair across the city, and service will be increased. So the hard part of adding capacity to the network is getting built, and the new line expands service to new areas, which will really benefit from it, so it's hard not to like the direction of the project overall, just the missed opportunities. And so that's Brisbane, a surprisingly solid transit city with the narrow-gauge AC-powered and highway transit lines of Perth, the integrated interurban rail services of Sydney, and a new platform screen door-equipped CBD tunnel like Melbourne. Oh, and a metro that isn't really like most metros. Perhaps Brisbane is the most Australian transit city out there. All I know is I can't wait to go back.